Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show, Red Pill Edition. My name is Leon Jones, and in this segment, I'm going to talk about another mental issue. And the mental issue is going to be what I call an inferior complex. So, the title of tonight's video is, do we have an inferiority complex? Do we have an inferiority complex? Now, before I go on, let me give a shout out to some people. Brother Sir Tice, shout out to you. Shout out to you, Little Big Nate. Shout out to Mr. Fantastic. Shout out to Brother Truth. Shout out to Theo Wolf. Shout out to Reg, the bad guy. Shout out to Trey, the NBD. Shout out to Melly Mel, SKC. Shout out to Mr. O and Brother Clue, Hood Conservative, and Abu Asama. I shouted those guys out. Oh, before I go on, shout out to Brother X. Check his channel out, the Prophet of Thought series. Very informative. If you want well-designed debates, he's the man to go to. Again, check out TPOT, the Prophet of Thought series. Again, I shouted out those guys because those guys have good material. Some of them are veterans. Some of them are regular folks. But they allow me to come on their panels to discuss my content. And here on YouTube, it is very important to give brothers a shout out. Now, some people might be asking me, why am I saying all this? Well, I am delivering this message because it's going to lead into tonight's topic. Do we have an inferiority complex? And it's a question that has to be answered. Now, when it comes to any type of mental disorder, there are causes, there are also treatments, but you also have to understand what the disorder is. Now, what I see from a number of individuals, particularly Black folk, we have the crabs in a barrel mentality, a number of us. We also have a funny way of defining what the term alpha is. And we also, as Black people, tend to work backwards. And I say that because if you look at a brother who's educated, he speaks well, he's not on a Democratic plantation, he's called a coon. He's always been told he's talking white, or you still another nigger. That kind of connotation. But then you get the individual who will come out of jail after serving his time or her time, eating 3 squares, lifting weights, being allowed to watch television, utilize the computer. But for the most part, they're celebrated. It's just like a number of us blacks celebrating a baby shower for a potential mother who's getting ready to have a baby out of wedlock. Now, again, why am I addressing all of these issues? Because when it comes to Western society today, what was actually normal, family, education, whether it's a trade, whether it's a profession, individuals that have manners and hierarchy. Boom, that's the word, hierarchy. That word was discussed on Little Nate's panel. And when it comes to hierarchy, I say a number of African Americans don't understand it. Why? Because there's jealousy involved as well, especially if your boss looks like you. You're going to hear the comment, you're no better than me. You're a sellout. All the shaming language. That kind of behavior is one that you have to plug into the question. Does this person feel inferior or white supremacy? Okay, at one time, there was racism. But do you think true racism exists? Yes, it does, but at a much smaller number than it did 40, 50, 60, 70, and even further in the past. Now, as a Black person, I've never experienced real racism. Again, looking at that word racism, we use it particularly if you're African American and you sit on the left side of the political spectrum. We use it as a shaming tool to silence debate, especially when the other side counters your message, and especially if the other side looks just like you. So the question that I have to put into proper context is this: the people who feel like victims, individuals who have failed in life, but they see individuals who are successful. Do they have an inferiority complex? Now, last week I talked about the Napoleon syndrome. But you can even tie the Napoleon syndrome into an inferiority complex, and you can even tie it into Stockholm syndrome. You see, what I see from people who are failing in life, talk about, a lot of them complain. See, it might not be that the person that's been a little more successful than them is better, but they've done a little more work. Maybe you've been stagnant. Now, I agree. If somebody is better than me, I'm going to pick their brain. because I want to make it to the level where they are. And I don't feel any resentment because at the time I'm at a lower level than they are. They took the time, they did the research, they knew how to navigate themselves through what we call the path of life to get where they wanted to go. And when we tie hierarchy into the mix, one must understand that in order to reach a certain level and be respected, you have to be a producer. You know, in the African American community, we come up with all kinds of sayings, and this is one that drives me crazy. Say what you mean what you say. Okay, that's just jargon that really has no meaning. Why? Because there's something missing. And again, if you want to make an equation work, what you do to one side, you do to the other side. So when it comes to mathematics, it's cumulative or it's associative when it comes to properties. Like, let me give you something that's associative. Associative means the numbers are the same, but you just move the parentheses, and the parentheses determine the operation. Like, I'll have parentheses under 1 plus 2, and then no parentheses when you add 3. And then the next equation, I have 1, and then I have plus, and then I have parentheses around 2 plus 3. Well, they're going to give you 6, but you just utilize different operations, or the sequence of operations is different. Now, still, is that answering the question of do you have an inferiority complex? When I talk about say what you mean what you say. Well, no, it doesn't. But one must understand that when you use that connotation, you always have to fill in the blank. And normally what I tell people is say what you mean, you follow it with action, mean what you say. Mean what you say because you have followed it with action, and now you can say what you mean. Why? Because in 2 places, you were able to back up your information with action. Now, when we talk about the inferiority complex, you have some people who think they're superior, which I am going to see if superiority is a complex as well. Because when somebody is overconfident, they tend to have a lot of ego. They're cocky. They love the bully. But when you counter what they say, they wilt like a flower. But right now, I'm connecting everything to the inferiority complex. And the reason why I'm doing that, because I believe a number of us have an inferiority complex, which also produces a number of individuals who aren't secure with themselves. You see, when I do a lot of psychological issues, there is one issue that could actually have branches of other issues. That's the fun thing about psychological issues. It's all about behavior. But when I talk about the inferiority complex, let me share my screen to get down to business here. One must understand that there are going to be symptoms, there are going to be causes, diagnosis, and treatment. And in this video, I am going to talk to you about everything that's involved with the inferiority complex. So strap your seatbelts on, relax, It's time to learn. So, as a human being, we all worry at times about our abilities. Although it's distressing, it's normal to question whether we measure up to others or to feel momentarily incompetent for, say, scoring lower on a test than those around us, or not performing as well as our coworkers, or for not yet being well situated in life as our friends. Now, if you take that little passage, it could be some feelings of insecurity, which again, insecurity does lead to inferiority. It's a complex. Now, for most of us, these feelings, again, I'm a genius because I've already mentioned it, but I'm going to say it again. For most of us, these feelings of insecurity and insufficiency, such as being unable to reach an intended goal, are highly situational or occasional. Now, when they arise, we may, example, brood about them for a time, and they will carry on. We deal with them by reminding ourselves that we have other strengths, or we use them as motivation to master the underlying program. Now, this has all been stated by James E. Maddox. He's a PhD psychologist and author of Subjective Well-Being and Life Satisfaction, and co-author of Psychopathology Foundations for a Contemporary Understanding. Now, a lot of us get in the predicament with stress or inferiority because could have been some major event that we were involved in and we still think about. Now, usually if you remember something like a war, that's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you have to understand this when it comes to major events, because when they occur, they cause our self-doubt to flare. Being fired from a job or being dumped by a romantic partner, most of us are able to turn to friends and family, and eventually we find our ways to feel secure, engaged, and productive. Now, here's something that you should understand. If you have an inferiority complex, an old-fashioned term for what Dr. Maddox instead calls chronic low self-esteem, yet you respond differently, you call yourself names, lament your shortcomings, and believe that your intense self-criticism is reasonable just whether your self-esteem is most fragile, you attack it even further. So the cycle is so deeply rooted that it consistently holds you back personally and professionally. Now, I'm just going to tell you this when it comes to life. And everybody has said this. You get what you expect, and people with very low self-esteem expect very little. Again, this is stated by Amy Flowers, PhD, a cognitive behavioral therapist in private practice in Brother Mr. Fantastic's hometown, Macon, Georgia. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. As disappointments mount, you become more discouraged and more vulnerable to being biased against yourself. Now, when you're biased against yourself, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. You're actually going to lash out at others who are doing better than you are. Why? Because you want to make yourself feel good. Now, this is a result of a pervasive feeling of being less than across most aspects of life: psychological, intellectual, social, and physical. Now, the good news is there are many things that you can do to curb these unhealthy responses. Overcome your psychological distress, rebuild your self-esteem, and enjoy a more fulfilling life. Again, I have given you an overview of the inferiority complex, but we need to go deeper. So where I'm going to go now, so we can lead into the symptoms and signs, where did it come from? So I'm going to do the history. Now, the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, defines an inferiority complex as a basic feeling of inadequacy and insecurity. Insecurity. I mentioned that twice in this video. Deriving from actual and imagined physical or psychological deficiency. Now, the term dates back to 1907 when it was coined by the influential psychoanalyst Alfred Adler to explain why so many people seem to lack the motivation to act in their own best interest and go after their goals in life. Now, contemporary psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals avoid the term now through notes, Maddox often characterizing it instead as simply low self-esteem. And generally, when somebody is insecure, they're going to have low self-esteem. But with any complex or disorder, what are the signs? What are the symptoms? Well, again, feeling inferior from time to time, that is basic human nature. Now, this is from Dr. Martin E. Ford, PhD. He's a professor and a senior associate dean from a college that I attended back in 2000, 2001, known as George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Now, he's a professor in the College of Education and Human Development. Now, the key when it comes to being inferior is how one responds to those feelings. Do they motivate you to learn and to try to do better, or do they cause you to ruminate and just completely shut down? Or perhaps even worse, do they cause you to feel jealous of others? Hint, hint, crabs in a barrel mindset of Black people. And if you feel jealous, what do? You put people down, basically build yourself up, or you just throw accountability out of the way and say, get out of my way with accountability. And then you add, you blame others. You blame others for things for which you should take your own personal responsibility. When such patterns become constant aboard a set of circumstances, that is when the term inferiority complex may apply. Now, the preposition is may. We will continue. Now, the essence of an inferior complex is having a collection of negative thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and tendencies. Signs, you may have one according to Depression Alliance include, this is very important, repetitively focusing on thoughts that are very upsetting, shutting down out of shame, guilt, embarrassment, or an inward sense of defeat, withdrawing from coworkers, colleagues, and family members. Now, here's one that a number of people do. Demeaning others as a way to transfer their feelings of isolation and failure. Now, again, psychology today notes that a person with an inferiority complex may also feel responsible for other people's shortcomings and failures. Again, person that has an inferiority complex is probably going to seek attention and validation by pretending to be sick, depressed, or by continually bringing the conversation back to them. And they also may avoid any type of competition where their efforts might be directly compared with others. Because people who have low self-esteem do not take risks. They don't try things and they end up missing out on many opportunities. And that's a fact. You don't even have to be a psychologist to say that. It is true life is a risk, and successful people have fallen, but you have to have the gumption to get back up. Now, also, people who have an inferiority complex may be extremely sensitive to both compliments and criticism. And I'm going to say criticisms for the most part because, particularly here in the manosphere, many of us African Americans, when our points are countered, we react very emotionally. And when we do that, we start to call names. We get very vile, hateful. That's because we're feeling very sensitive. That's why many of us always try to be right. Well, in the real world, you're not always going to be right. Also, you're going to exhibit personality traits such as perfectionism and neuroticism, which is a tendency toward anxiety, depression, and other negative feelings. Again, if you've been watching my videos, those words come from other disorders. And I'm talking about depression, anxiety, and of course, stress. Now, when it comes to having an inferiority complex, well, there are causes and risk factors. Now, research suggests that a behavior, or we can say behavioral and psychological characteristics associated with an inferiority complex basically arise from a combination of factors, including genetic predisposition. For example, a study in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science found that people who inherited a variation in a receptor for oxytocin, a hormone that contributes to positive emotions, felt less optimistic, had lower self-esteem, and felt less personal mastery than people who inherited a different type of receptor for oxytocin. Number two, family of origin. Again, diabetes, heart disease, they're all hereditary. So we're going back to the family of origin. Now, according to Maddox, who has studied self-esteem for decades, your early caregivers can have an enormous impact on whether a genetic tendency toward self-doubt is exasperated or softened, because a child whose highly critical parent repeatedly says things like, "You're stupid, you're a klutz," or "You never do anything right," may internalize those admonishments so completely that they carry them into adulthood. Now, again, that's also borderline abuse when you're constantly putting down a child. And this is what happens in a number of families of all races. That's known as dysfunction as well. If you start programming your child with negativity, they're going to grow up being negative and they're not going to accomplish anything in life. And they may be in poverty, jail, or dead. Now, when you are very young and impressionable, again, when you're very young and impressionable and faced with constant criticism, you feel powerless, worthless, ashamed, shy, and unenthusiastic most of the time. Now, this is what Dr. Elaine Aron, who is a psychologist, says, and she's also the author of Undervalued Self, feeling that all must be your fault. You undervalue yourself chronically. And then we get into society. And I tell you, you want an education? The real world is when you walk right out that door, because today in society, and it's been happening over the past 50 years, unrealistic standards coming from advertisers, social media, and celebrities and other figures of authority can create or reinforce perceptions about oneself that lead to enormous self-doubt. Now, when society bombards us with messages about how we should act, what we should acquire, and what about type, size, and color our bodies should be, we internalize and feel diminished to such an extent that it affects our own assessment of who we are and what our real worth is, says Karen Shapiro. She's also a licensed clinical social worker and a psychotherapist in private practice in New York City. Now, people who have very low self esteem tend to compare themselves more with others, those flowers. And when they compare themselves only to the most successful people. Again, when you start comparing yourself to somebody on another level, and then you start shaming that person because they're more successful than you are, then you have an inferiority complex. Why? Because you are insecure. Now, what you should do, you should learn from that successful person. And when it comes to men here in this society, what we're not taught is that competition makes you better. We're always taught that we're all equal, everybody gets a participation trophy. Bullshit. That's why many men and women aren't successful today, because we've alluded to everybody's feelings instead of teaching them that the real world is competitive. If you cannot compete, you will get left out. Now, I've talked about the history of the inferiority complex. I gave you an overview, talked about some causes. But how is the inferiority complex diagnosed? Because an inferiority complex is not a diagnosable mental health disorder. Instead, clinicians use low self-esteem as one possible symptom when they assess for other psychological problems, including, again, here are other disorders that are tying right into the inferiority complex: anxiety disorders. And with the anxiety disorder, if you feel as if you are not as good as others, it can provoke, it will provoke, depending on what person you are, anxiety in many situations. Also, you may have depressive disorders. Now, the link with depression is particularly strong. For instance, one large scale meta analysis of 77 prior studies published in the Journal Psychological Bulletin showed that low self esteem is a key factor in the development and maintenance of depression. Now, when it comes to time, what is the duration of an inferiority complex? Well, an untreated inferiority complex can endure for years, even a lifetime, primarily because it is so hard for people with an entrenched negative view of themselves to absorb positive information that challenges the view. And this is explained by Aaron. Indeed, she cites landmark research published in the journal Psychological Science, and that basically found that telling people with low self-esteem what's going to happen is they're going to repeat affirmations like, I am enough. That can actually be ineffective and even harmful. Repeating positive self-statements may benefit certain people, but backfire for the very people who need them the most. Now, when people with low self-esteem repeated the statement, I'm a lovable person, or focused on ways in which the statement was true of them, neither their feelings about themselves nor their moods improved. Instead, they got worse. So here's what I'm going to say. I don't think anyone with a real inferiority complex can psych themselves out of it alone. Why? Because when you're used to being down, you are basically programmed, because you put yourself in a negative environment. So the way to basically bring yourself up, you have to have another person to validate and affirm your wealth so that it becomes believable. Again, you're going to need validation from another person. Let them affirm your worth. And a thing about that too is the validation going to be sincere, because here in 2021, number of people want to tell you what you want to hear just to make you feel good. And what you've seen from a number of people, the reason why they feel negative today, again, the reason why people feel negative today is because they've been lied to. They've been lied to by television, religion, education. They've been lied to at their jobs. They've been lied to by the government. They've been lied to by their families. Why? Because other people don't want to take on your problems, number one. And number two, for the most part, number of individuals are comfortable with being a victim. Now, when it comes to any type of disorder, well, treatment, medication options, tips for overcoming an inferiority complex. So, is there a way to heal? The answer is yes, but that person has to want to heal. Now, treatment today usually involves one of two approaches or a combination of both, and possibly medication as well. Now, I have my skepticism about medication, because what medication does, it keeps the pharmaceutical companies rich. And I just believe that we are over medicated. It's like we're drug addicts, but legal drug addicts. And in the end, drugs only help the symptoms. When you're dealing with a mental disorder, it's psychological. It's about your behavior, because drugs are only temporary. But I digress. Now, again, when it comes to solving the problem of having an inferiority complex or healing, there are two approaches or a combination of both. Number one is known as CBT. That's cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, there is tons of evidence of the effectiveness of CBT. Now, what CBT does is, in a very structured way, it teaches people how to examine the negative thoughts and feelings they're having in the moment and gradually change them over time by checking their validity. And I am really a totally incompetent person who never does anything right, or is that a cognitive distortion? Now, cognitive distortions are thoughts, patterns that basically erode self-esteem. Now, this is according to the Mayo Clinic. And I'm going to give you some examples right now. And the link to what I'm talking about is going to be found at the bottom of my video. So click on the link so you'll know that I am not talking BS. I'm putting my own words into this information, and I'm using an article. Now, the Mayo Clinic says there's all or nothing thinking. And that is, you see things as either all good or all bad. For example, I'm a total failure because it took me more time than I said I would need to write this report. Then you would have mental filtering. And that is, by focusing only on the negatives, you distort your view of yourself. For example, if I am late to the meeting, everyone will know that I am a loser. Now, just looking at that statement, doesn't that sound like a little bit of paranoia? That's going to be something else I talk about. Stay tuned for that, because paranoia is also a problem as well. It's almost like you're in the land of hallucination. You're thinking of something that is happening, but it really isn't happening. But when we get into eroding self-esteem, you can look at converting positives into negatives. And this is all from the Mayo Clinic. And what happens when you do that, you basically undervalue your success and compliments. For example, I only got the job because no one else wanted it. A person with chronic low self-esteem has learned to filter their successes out, undervalue them time and time again. And then, you ever heard of people, you're saying something and they've been used to being negative, and they jump the gun before you're even finishing your point? They already have a negative conclusion because they don't trust themselves. Again, they have low self-esteem. And with this is you reach a negative conclusion with little or no evidence that supports it. For example, my coworker went to lunch without me, so she must be mad at me. And then here's something a lot of people do. They mistake feelings for facts. And when you do that, you basically, in my humble opinion, you've really failed yourself. You're really in the land of low self-esteem. Because what is happening is, because you are very emotional, you can't get a hold of your emotions. Everything that you are feeling, you believe it to be facts when it isn't facts. For example, I don't think I'm attractive, so I must be ugly. It's always a negative connotation with it. Now, psychodynamic therapy, or talk therapy, according to the American Psychiatric Association. And here's what they said. Most people who receive psychotherapy experience relief and are better and able to function in their lives. Now, again, to get the most help out of psychotherapy for chronic low self-esteem. And when I'm talking about self-esteem, because one thing I will tell you, language changes. Low self-esteem is actually a word for inferiority complex. Just remember that. Again, so to get the most out of psychotherapy for chronic low self-esteem, the first step to take is to develop a really deep understanding of where this feeling of diminishment is coming from. And you have to delve into the messaging that came early in life and exploring the situations that reinforce the feeling of not being good enough. Next, we will help shift the focus away from what they lack to the positive things about themselves and their lives. Once we, so to speak, and even out everything in the playing field, or we can say even out the playing field, the next thing to do, we go from a position of positive self-regard, and then we repair their sense of self-confidence and self-esteem. So what we're doing, we're moving the needle from negative to positive. And then good old medication. Now, when an individual has low self-esteem along with certain psychological conditions such as severe anxiety or depression, medication may be warranted. Now, according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of American, options when it comes to medications include antidepressants such as selective serotonin, reuptake inhibitors known as SSRIs, and serotonin norepinephrine intake or reuptake inhibitors known as SNRIs. And I apologize that the name of that medicine was almost unpronounceable for me. When you get into any type of medical, they love using the long words to make themselves sound so sophisticated. Now, again, I'm just going to go over it again when it comes to medication, because the options include, and I'm just going to shorten them up with the acronyms here, SSRIs and SNRIs, which increase the levels of mood lifting hormones in the brain by preventing their reabsorption by neurons. Now, when it comes to inferiority complex, so we say low self-esteem. In some cases, people who continually see themselves as being lesser than those around them or as failing to meet society standards may experience high psychological distress that leads to self-harming behaviors such as cutting and substance abuse or even suicide. Again, do you see how all of these mental disorders are connecting to one another? This is a good thing about psychology. Now, let me tell you this. What's more, an inferiority complex can cause a widespread internalized sense of self-defeat or self-loathing in entire culture groups that face stereotypes and discrimination based on what? Age, race, class, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and other factors. Now, I had to bring that up because that is what you are seeing today. In fact, the party on the left, and I don't mean to bring politics into it, that's basically what they subscribe to. Why? Because that's all they got. If you make people feel less than what they are, they can always be victims, and then they can always make the people who have more feel guilty. And then the policies come in where you get redistribution of resources to try to equal everything out. But an egalitarian society doesn't work. We all know that. But now you need to hear this, though. If you're born a woman, for example, you're very vulnerable to an inferiority complex. Why? Because women have long been viewed in our society as inferior to men, especially in certain fields such as the sciences, sports, and business. Now, let me clarify that too. Women don't go into the same career fields that men do. When it comes to women's sports, certainly you have the UConn basketball team, you have Baylor, you have Notre Dame, North Carolina, South Carolina, Duke. Well, what happens is women's sports don't draw enough attendance. And when it comes to business, I'm just going to say this, a number of women just don't make good leaders because, number one, they always believe that they have to prove something to make themselves feel good. And what they do is, if they have a number of men working under them, they become tyrants. So you can't work with people who feel inferior. In other words, a number of women do feel inferior to men. In those areas, it's because men have built those areas. And without men building the sciences and the sports and the businesses, we wouldn't have the society that we have now. But I digress. As a result, even a woman whose self-esteem is intact day to day has to battle against feeling inferior in the workforce, a feeling that's reinforced by factors like the ongoing wage gap between men and women and the lack of women in leadership roles. Let me stop right there. There is no wage gap. Again, women and men do different types of jobs. That wage gap bullshit has been going on for years and years, and the feminists have always looked to that. And if there is a wage gap, somebody show me where you got that information. First of all, when it comes to leadership roles, again, there are women in some leadership roles, but I can tell you right now, you look at DC, you look at Baltimore, you look at Chicago, you look at New Orleans, you look at Rochester, New York, they're all run by women. And they're all catastrophic because those are the cities that have high crime. Now, Rochester, New York is a very small city. However, a woman runs it. You have women in Congress. Their policies, they don't make sense because for the most part, it's women who basically take from the system without replenishing it. Women get a little older. They have to go to the doctor more. So it's not that they can't lead. Many of them aren't stable in the mind enough to lead. And the problem is in the workforce, we keep handing women and even some men positions that they're not qualified for. And because to make people feel good, we've diluted the workforce and we diluted the military. But again, I'm going to move on because that is a different subject. Now, the effect is measurable because a growing body of evidence shows that compared with men, women don't consider themselves ready for promotions. So they'll predict they'll do worse on tests and they generally underestimate their abilities. In other words, they psych themselves out. You see, this is what I tell people. When you believe that you are lower than somebody, then you've already lost the battle. And when I talk about these issues, it's not collective, it's all individual. And again, one must understand there are related conditions to the inferiority complex. Again, there are related conditions to the inferiority complex. And in addition to them, let's add depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. That's also associated with eating disorders. So negative feelings about body image contribute to eating disorders, which is an estimated 30 million Americans, including 10 million boys and men, experience some point in their lives. And that's according to the National Eating Disorders Association, known as NEDA. Now, here's the $1 million question. How can you tell the difference between a superiority and inferiority complex? Because they do seem like they are opposite sides of the same coin. Well, another off sign of an inferiority complex is the opposite. I call it NPD. Again, you see how the language changes? They use low self-esteem for inferiority complex. Then when we get to a superiority complex, they use NPD, which is a narcissistic personality disorder. And I can't wait to do that one. That is going to be a fun one because that's known as the superiority complex. So how can the two be linked? Because according to the APA definition, the telltale signs of a superiority complex is basically an exaggerated opinion of one's abilities and accomplishments. And basically that arises from an overcompensation of feelings of inferiority. So they both do tie into one another. So what you're doing is you're overvaluing yourself and you have unrealistic expectations. And again, as Mayo Clinic experts explain, although people with narcissistic personality disorders may appear to have an inflated sense of their own importance, behind the mask of an ultra confidence lies a fragile self-esteem, vulnerable to the slightest criticism. And again, when we deal with low self-esteem, victimization, depression, anxiety, even stress ties into it. And what I'm telling you is, if you want to get relief, you have to be accountable for your health. Now, again, I said this about the African American community, and I do see it here on YouTube. Low self-esteem also produces jealousy, shaming, ad hominem attacks. You go in areas where many of us have been, more feeling down about ourselves, because you have a number of people who are looking for sympathy as well. And for the sympathy choir out there, if they're defending low self-esteem individuals and they're telling low self-esteem individuals not to do anything about their negative feelings, well, they're just as low. Because again, all these individuals are self-loathing. Now, I'm not saying that the complex of inferiority doesn't exist. It does. But at the same token, life isn't fair. You have to compete when it comes to life. Number of individuals can use different disorders just to stay where they are. Many individuals today, and I'm talking about from the baby boomers all the way down, they don't want to take accountability. A number of them don't want to go to the doctor. I mean, you look at what's going on right now. You have individuals out here who are sheeple. They really think that jab works. Now, something that I'm going to tell you right now, a father of a Miami-Dade mayor passed away from the jab. Now, this is going outside an inferiority complex, but it's also going to connect to an inferiority complex too. Because you have individuals out here who've already had the jab, and they're trying to tell people who haven't had the jab to go get the jab, when, in my humble opinion, the ones who got the jab didn't take any time to research. Again, they followed what the false science said, and they went on and got it, had side effects. Some of them passed away. And I don't believe that everybody is passing away with the 19 anyway. They just want the numbers because, again, utilizing this virus, it starts to give people in government the control of our lives if we allow it. And I will say this about government officials. You want to know why they control our lives? Because even I just mentioned the 19, because they're inferior. Many of these politicians, they want to take from the people because the job that they do is very easy. Nothing's going to change. They go into Washington, and even your local politicians, they're all about extending the public sector. But the public sector draws everything from the private sector. Nobody mentions that. But if you look at what's going on here in this culture, the left side of the political spectrum, they encourage the inferiority complex. That's why they talk so much about racism, sexism. Well, if you don't like a woman, you're a misogynist. But they never call themselves out. Well, if you don't like a man, you're a misandrist. If you're not for the LGBTQ community, you're xenophobic. But you never tell the LGBTQ community that they're anti-heterosexual because it doesn't fit the narrative. You have a lot of your educators. They also have the inferiority complex because when you challenge their points, what they're going to do, they're going to insult you or they're going to give you a bad grade because they believe that they have the power over you. And because they're so self-loathing, down on themselves, because they are where they are, and you are one day going to surpass them, they're upset about it. They feel inferior. You see, there's the actual inferiority complex, and then there's basically self-loathing, which they all tie together. Low self-esteem, that ties together as well. But you have a number of individuals that don't want to be accountable. They're lazy. They believe that somebody should be giving them a handout. You have a number of individuals that don't want to go to work, but yet they'll tell you there are no jobs out there. But yet, if a man is making or a woman is making a lot of money, they want to shame that person for being successful. And then they want to come up with ways that they can extract that money from the person who's successful and give it to the person who's not successful. And when it comes to the inferiority complex, that does cause a divide because you have Black people. And it's a shame for me to say this, Black people disliking other Black people. Because you have the Black people who are on the left, your pastors, your race hustlers, your conscious community, your Black feminists. They feel that every Black should be over there. And this is why you have the gynocracy too, because in actuality, the gynocracy, something that women came up with to give them that false power. Why? Because what's standing in between men having power and women having power is the government. And see what the government has done, they've taken away power from men and given it to women, and you see what's going on here. But in the end, a lot of what the government is giving you is smoke and mirrors. But again, this video is not about men and women. So please, you don't have to agree with this material. I'm just giving you some insight that you need to hear. Because when you come here on the 411 Talk Zone radio show, I don't do anything but talk about the real world. But in the end, I'm also trying to give you an idea of where you are in life and why you are suffering with low self-esteem. And something else, delusion. Delusion is another version of low self-esteem. You hear of all this body positivity. You look at your appearance. You're wearing a bunch of tattoos. You're wearing nose rings, all this colored hair. You may think you are on top of the world, but all that's happening is this. You're getting looked down upon. Why? Because you're never going to, unless you get into something that you're going to be accepted into, you're never going to be out there in the corporate world. you're not going to get a trade. You're going to be the sorry losers living in your mom's basement. You see, one thing I can tell you about the inferiority complex too, and it's not recognized by the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Not in there. Why? Because it's a disorder, but it's one of those that, should we call it a disorder and put it in the DSM, or should we not? There's a lot of studies on it. But basically, when it comes to inferiority, what you are is self-loathing. You have a low self-esteem. But if you want to continue envying somebody, because envy and jealousy are all part of the inferiority complex. But if you want to become a leader, learn how to compete. Because competition makes everyone a better person, especially when you have to be accountable and productive. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some STEM education, you check out my Mind of STEM channel. On that channel, I give you a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Haven't done one in a while, but I still do have my blog talk radio show. A blog talk radio show is basically the same as doing a panel, and I talk about the same issues. 215-383-5785 is the number. And if you can't find me on YouTube, you can't find me on Blog Talk Radio, you can find the 411 Talk Zone radio show on Twitter, MeWe, and Parler. And you can find the Mind of STEM channel on Twitter. Now, the reason why I don't put the Mind of STEM channel on MeWe and Parler is because those platforms are for political content. But in the meantime, I'm not asking for it. But if you want to put a little something in the plate for giving you this fantastic content, $ LEJ 0102 1965 is the Cash App link at the bottom of my videos. And at the end of the day, I'm going to leave you with this. Be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Always know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And for you dissenters and detractors, you listen to my content and you feel offended, I want to share this with you. If it doesn't apply, let it fly. But if the shoe fits, wear it. If you don't like the shoe, change it. And once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful and gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.